my topic today is a mix between using my telepathic powers, my psychic powers, and reading palms and talking to you about the future. I know it's not about next week's lotto numbers. That's purely for myself. And essentially looking at 8 different trends in facility management more holistically, not just focusing on specific areas, but taking a more zoomed out approach and looking at where we could possibly be at 2027, and more importantly, for all facility managers, both virtually and attending here live, how exactly can you play a part to make that a reality and actually be more proactive as an organization? Okay, so the first trend we're going to start off with, and this is essentially something that is quite well known. We've all become quite the expert in hybrid working and everything around it in recent times. But essentially from a facility management perspective, the most important thing I believe that we've learned from the pandemic, especially from a hybrid working experience, is the importance of building occupancy and your capacity planning aspects like this. I've noticed with some of our existing clients that it's all of a sudden overnight it became a reality that you needed to know how many people are in your building, not just on a spreadsheet view, but you needed to adapt those numbers. You needed to change certain capacities on a floor from 100 people to 70 people to 30 people. And without any sort of information or backing around it, it would have been a little bit more difficult to do so. So that was the first realization I've seen from a pandemic perspective and how it has influenced what we do today. And then, of course, there's the factor of the collaborative workplace phenomena, in getting the sort of engagement from all of our personnel and occupants in our buildings and getting that sort of engagement as part of reality. Because what we've seen now is anybody, or most people at least, can do what they do remotely. They can do things wherever they want. They can do it at their holiday home here in Georgia as well. And essentially, we need to ensure that our buildings still have a purpose. And these buildings needs to serve as a collaborative and a place where people can engage. And as a facility manager, it is your role to play a part in that and ensure that this collaboration is facilitated not just with your traditional infrastructure, but also ensuring that the planning and the strategies around it are also facilitated in the same manner. And that essentially is the expanded role of facilities management. And I believe using technology as an enabler is an extremely important part in this, because it is something that is agnostic to a particular human being. It is quite important in terms of growing from an industry long-term perspective. And we'll touch on it a little bit later with business resilience as well. I just want to make a quick note. My timer isn't on. I'm just not too mindful at the time I have spent. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. It's still not working. Okay, I think we're back. There we go. Okay, so the next 2 trends on sustainability and compliance. This is an aspect that I thought about last night that I'm really not going to talk as much as I would like to about this, because we covered this so well yesterday. There's a couple of pointers that I do want to address though. And essentially, when we talk about sustainability from a policy perspective, I think it's also important that we outline that sustainability policies needs to be driven in line with your identity as an organization. And you'll see also when we talk about compliance, I think it's critical driving it from the identity of your organization, because it's something that can be adopted really well by your workforce, your building occupants, because it is something that they're synonymous with. It's a way of working, essentially. And something that we will be seeing in the next 5 years, I believe, is a real convergence between ESG, which we talked heavily about yesterday, and your CSR. For those that don't know what CSR is, it's that page that's currently on everybody's website and not many people know about, which is definitely going to change. It's a convergence that I believe is going to happen. And from a customer perspective, what's in it for them? It's the attractiveness of the buildings in itself. Having attractive buildings, not just physically, but in terms of serving that personal experience factor, is something that is definitely going to influence the way that people adhere to these policies from both a sustainability perspective and standards as well that we talked about yesterday. So essentially, when we talk about compliance, hand in hand with that, of course, we know we have our legal compliance from a regulatory perspective. We talked quite a bit about that as well. But we also have the corporate compliance aspect, and one thing that I also want to mention from an ESG aspect is that there's a lot of growth opportunity that investors are currently seeing at the moment from ESG. It's currently being seen as a non-financial gain that can be used to monitor the health not only of a building or a portfolio of buildings, but an organization as a whole. So it is a different factor of influence that is currently also being involved when we talk about ESG. And obviously this is going to lead in the next 5 years to a tricky balance between the interests of building owners and your building occupants, because you're going to need to balance from a financial perspective, the regulations on a non-financial perspective, but also your building occupants' personal experience and their needs as such. Now, next up, this is something I believe South Africa, we've reacted really well to this, and it's something that's going to continue to grow in the next 5 years, and that's the improvement in resilience. And this is a triangle where I believe you can't talk about one without the other, and that is business resilience, business continuity, and then your adaptability as well. These three areas are essentially what's going to help us be a bit more robust as an organization moving forward. And the obvious question and the obvious way of engaging with people these days, instead of asking how the weather was, we typically now ask how rapid was your response to the pandemic, and what have you done? What challenges have you faced? And that's become the real talking point. And if anything, it's something that is going to drive our strategies from an emergency scenario planning perspective moving forward. But it is also something that's going to highlight knowledge gaps. When we talk about business continuity, we have to talk about knowledge continuity. And we often talk about the aspect of what happens when if somebody really experienced gets run over by a bus tomorrow, is his role going to be fulfilled? How is his responsibilities going to be taken over? And we always talk about it, but we've never had a pandemic like we've had now, where we've needed to respond to things like this. And the need for changing how we plan for the future is definitely driven by resilience. I've got an interesting harsh quote at the top there. It's a bit of a statistic. About 40% of businesses in the USA have not reopened after the disaster, and another 25% are expected to fail in the year ahead. It's a harsh reality. And when we talk about the South African market and how volatile we are, that is something that we cannot exclude as well. And talking about controversial points and realities, I believe the Great Resignation is also something that we need to consider. We know about the Great Depression, but how many of us know about the Great Resignation? And this is typically what we call the big quit. And it is a trend that we've seen recently, and this is globally, a shift in purpose for your employees and your workforce. The pandemic has taught so many of us that, life is too short. Maybe we need to focus on our passions a little bit more. And if you think of that in numbers, that can lead to a mass excess of people in general. And we've seen a shift from stability-focused to purpose-driven intent in terms of the workforce in itself. And think of the stat that you see at the top there, also US-based, but now I'd like you to think of it in the context of South Africa being a country that has a 34% unemployment rate. For that to still be relevant in South Africa tells us how much purpose has driven our individuals and how much we are willing to sacrifice to actually adhere to that. And then, of course, just beware of these people we call the Gen Zs. Okay, I'm also slightly in there, so I'd be very mindful of what I say. But the truth is, the Gen Zers, as we call them, are the future of the workforce, and they've recently entered the workforce. A large batch of matriculants and university students that are coming out now are the Gen Zers. And we've seen a lot of statistics out there at the moment that have measured what they would like from industry, what they would like from a job, and the purpose that they see. And I urge facility managers as a whole to keep this in mind, because when you are prioritizing the needs of your facilities and your demographics within your buildings, keep in mind the priorities and the purposes of this vast range of demographics that we have. Because a Gen Z, for example, might not be willing to work one job for the rest of their life. They might be a little bit more purpose-driven. They might have a couple years and move over to a next role. And the truth is, you can't, from a talent retention perspective, which leads back to our continuity and our knowledge gaps that we talked about previously. When we talk about the mass exit or the talent retention, these aspects cannot be ignored entirely because of the fact that talent is something that is going to be shifted across our organizations, across our industries, but we need to ensure that the plan is in place to keep the knowledge centralized. And the best agnostic way that I can think of doing this is from a data perspective and from technology and setting up things that are more role-based rather than personnel-based. Because then you have knowledge at the places that you need it at the right time for the right people. So moving on from this, we talk about data in itself, and there's going to be a bit more emphasis on quantitative and measurable use of this data. We had a good discussion with one of our speakers yesterday about this, in terms of big data. I recall some interesting points being mentioned there. And often what we realize is that technology is considered as the silver bullet because it is creating this massive amounts of data, and we all get so excited because now we have information, and now this information needs to tell us things. And I used to ask people, do you listen to your data? And I had to rethink that recently and say, can you listen to your data? Because we completely ignore the fact of validity, the integrity of the data and aspects like this. And that's why it's important to ask, can you listen to your data? Because data only affects decision making if it is useful. And that's why I believe leading towards 2027, a successful organization will not be the one with the most data, but rather the most effective data. Because those are the data points, in essence, that will drive decision making. Not make decisions, but it will drive decision making. Okay, and then we have, away from the acronyms, more to the abbreviations, we have the rise of prop tech. A lot of you might be familiar with this concept, and for those that are not, it's an idea that, or an ideology really, that's going to be blending the real estate traditions with technology and software and make them synonymous with one another, and that's hence the property and the technology, prop tech. And an interesting stat being that 96% of investors believe in prop tech in itself as a mechanism that speeds up technology adoption. That's taken from Metaprop. And I quite like the definition of blending brick and mortar with bits and bytes, because I believe that's really the future in terms of what we're trying to do with buildings. When we talk about smart buildings, we talk about smart technology and IoT. And two factors we need to consider in terms of this is, of course, your building performance. And this is traditionally what we know in terms of measuring and monetizing your certain aspects of the building, your control aspects, systems, IoT devices, and so forth. But then there's the other aspect of occupant experience that I alluded to earlier. We need to ensure that the building performance and what the building tells us is in line with the needs of our occupants in the building. And those two factors go hand in hand and form the concept of smart buildings, in my opinion, and sensor tech, another abbreviation, of course. And then, of course, when we talk about it from an investor perspective, what's in it for them? Firstly, and probably the most obvious one, is the reduction in operating costs. I know that was mentioned yesterday as well. Having buildings operate a lot more lean is going to reduce the costs, as we know, and that's quite common. That's what we expect. But there's other aspects to it. There's the corporate identity of your buildings. You want to have that level of marketability, if you put it that way, of your premises, and it makes it a lot more attractive and a lot more lucrative to your competitors. And a great example is, you look at a lot of people that are applying to different jobs these days, seeing a massive building in Sandton and having a bit of a vision of myself working inside one of those offices and merging my personal experiences with my career objectives. That's something that really excites me, and it makes me more motivated to work for an organization like that. So it's also a competitive edge from an organization and an investor perspective. Okay, and the last trend that I want to talk about is, of course, smarter integrations of operating tech. And this is something I've seen firsthand when we talk about how organizations typically operate from a facility management standpoint. I've seen both locally and internationally that there's a very large emphasis on working as a silo or multiple silos, within facility management. There's oftentimes we have a maintenance director, we have a space director that only see each other once a year at an annual meeting. And then I often ask the questions from a technology standpoint. What happens when the space managers are responsible for the utilization of the spaces, and let's say they're involved in reservations of meeting rooms, things like this, whereas maintenance is also responsible for maintaining certain spaces in a building? What happens when that particular space is being utilized by somebody, but there's actually, it needs to be booked out for a certain portion of the day because somebody needs to carry out maintenance? That sort of collaboration, it seems like a simple example, but they knit together quite well when we talk about the whole picture or the holistic view of facility management, incorporating real estate as well. So, of course, in line with that, we need to talk about operational technology. We need to talk about information technology, because previously what we understood as operating tech was your SCADA systems, your PLCs, these sort of things. And information technology was more enterprise level. It was more focused on the input process and the output of your business organization. And I believe in the next coming years, we're going to see a bit of a emerging factor, convergence between those two aspects. And a great example is your BMS systems of today. It started off traditionally as just a consolidation tool of various sensors, but it's opened itself up to being a driver for other systems to leach information from and take that raw data and transform it into information that can add value and can contribute towards your decision making. So that's a great example, of course, from building management systems. But another factor that is also quite interesting is your digital twins. That is something that's gaining a lot of traction recently. And what your digital twins really do is it augments daily operations. It allows your organizations to do things that could not be done previously on a human level. And the closest comparison I could think of it in the previous decades was, in fact, your databases. That's something that really revolutionized the technological field in such. And this is something that I heavily back from digital twins as well. So I believe, especially with your smarter integrations and operating tech, systems of the future will not be merited purely on functionality, but rather in its capability to communicate with other systems, because that's essentially the sort of mesh that you would like to create with your organization from a technology perspective. Okay, so I really like the concept of agents of change, part of this conference, and I started asking myself, and along with Peter as well, how can we play our part in this, and from Vetasi's perspective, we believe that being agents of change and being more action-orientated, we are willing to invest in a workshop with each and every one of your organizations purely to understand if there are some of these gaps within these 8 trends and assist you in planning for them in the upcoming 5 years. So by all means, scan this QR code if you're joining in virtually. I've distributed some pamphlets earlier on. You're welcome to scan it there. But reach out to us. Peter's here. I'm here myself. Mela's going to be presenting later from Planon, our strategic partner as well. So really appreciate the opportunity and thank you.